Hello everyone, welcome. Today you're going to get a deep dive into some more textures. That's right, even more textures to break down, to look at in detail and produce our own little texture mood board where you'll have a lot more confidence by the end of the day in looking at textures of trees and greenery, textures of water and reflections, and textures of window reflections, which is a ludicrously challenging subject sometimes. But by the end of today, it won't feel like that. By the end of today, I really hope you'll have loads of ideas and just feel more confident in approaching these tricky areas. This is part 2, so if you want part 1, there's a link below in the description where you can jump on and see the other part where I covered roofs, walls and floors, ground, gravel, that kind of thing. Now here is one of the fun ones. We are doing textures of trees and nature. I absolutely love this because trees provide so much drama to a scene, so much context. They also just, in reality, just having a tree in a city scene and an urban scene or in a rural scene, it just makes it feel more homely to me. So let's take the smaller image on the left of that tree, which is forming a lovely kind of shape. And we're going to focus on how we could possibly capture exactly what's going on in that tree's texture with a few simple marks. So firstly, again, I'm going to recommend that this is all about that contour. And the contour, we need to think about not just the shape of the tree, but also the texture of the edge. And we're imagining, or at least what I'm doing, is imagining the shapes of the leaves as I draw in the little patches of, well, groupings of the leaves, which is really forming the bulk of the tree, isn't it? So we just start with a loose little contour of our tree where we're thinking about all those little factors as well. And then we're now looking for the shadows as well as focusing on the kind of textures being formed within those shadows. So for me, this tree has lots of just very densely packed little leaves, especially in the shadows. So we find these densely packed bits, and all I'm doing is little random marks. Can't actually see the shape of the leaves from this far away, can we? We can just see the effect that they're bringing. Now where there's more light, actually the leaves are almost like just little dots separated by light. So maybe we go from random marks forming the shadows. A lot of the shadows are kind of at the bottom of these bundles, but sometimes they're near the top as well. And then where there's light, we can just apply a few little dots. So there's lots of ways we could experiment, and I'm sure you could even do all 4 boxes and apply different ways of forming these textures, forming these shadows for this one tree. And I think that'd actually be quite a fun little study of this tree. It's not what I'm going to do today, but it's an idea for you to do. I'm going to move on just to give you lots of different ideas as well. It's not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to move on and give you lots of little ideas for other things, but it's not a bad idea by any means. For the trunk, don't forget that's got texture as well as shadow, so a little bit of hatching. And then we can also find, running up through the tree, the same kind of textures as the trunk in these branches. So you find a few little branches and you can apply a different contrasting kind of mark that induces that feeling of texture. And then you can build more of your leaf textures around that. And in doing this, in just a couple of minutes, we've built up, not a super realistic tree, but a good representation, a good sketch of this tree without the fuss, without over-focusing or over-drawing. Now let's move on. Let's move to the idea of bark. So one lovely bark to try and capture is this silver birch in the top left. And that again is going to start with the contour, isn't it? And the contour isn't a straight line, because what we have is a straight line and little notches, little knots coming out. And then we've got the other side, which is a bit straighter actually, it's a little bit straighter. So you can get that idea, just bring it down. We could go into the distance. Look, this reference is absolutely filled with them, so we could go into the distance. But remember when we talked about the importance of line weight and varying it? Here, this photo is all about this tree. So in the distance, we want these same ideas, these kind of not quite smooth trunks, but we don't want them to overtake this front tree. This front tree needs to be the boldest, it needs the most variation, because it's what really the scene is about. So that's a little practice about composition as well, really, which is great. Great fun to be able to practice more than one thing at once. Now coming across, what have we got? We've got lots of little black horizontal lines. So we can find those, but we're also going to find there's not just that single texture. We also have these kind of knots, haven't we, which have got a lot more depth to them. They're not though totally black, they've got white within them, so we need to keep our marks fluidly representing that. A few little other black marks, and look, our texture has emerged. What we might also notice is there's shadow, and that shadow we could do with our ink. We could do some light hatching, or with our ink we can apply just a slightly bolder line to that shadowed side. That gives the impression of shadow. And when we come up with our watercolours, actually we can use our watercolours to softly show this shadow. So that's what we'll do this time. But equally you could do some really gentle hatching to show both the texture and the shadow of this lovely sort of bark. Now let's do another bark, because I think this other bark is very different, and it's interesting to see how the same kind of thing might be so different. And what we've got here is a tree trunk zoomed in, and we're looking at the top middle bark picture. Feels like an oak tree to me. What we've got now, instead of having horizontal lines, we've got all these spanning sort of vertical flowing lines, and they just go up and down, but they wobble around as well. And within that you have light and shadow. Although it's all sort of relatively deeper tones and more murky colours, you have certainly got like valleys and hills, haven't you? Basically the tops of the bark and the bottoms of the bark. So what we want to do is be able to capture that. So we identify which of our little vertical structures is light and which are dark. And within the dark ones we can apply some simple hatching. And that way we can build up this texture being sort of formed of light and dark, as well as having just a lot of simple ink marks, non sort of representative. These are just adding a kind of texture which is showing what our pen can do, but is also helping to explain something about this bark. And then maybe what we want to do again is explore a bit more with a bolder pen. We can almost outline some of these darker areas. We can do some other hatching with this pen, which is going to be immediately much bolder. We can find little areas in this light, there's little areas of dark, so we could just do a little bit of extra mark making there as well. And we don't want to overdo it, so again we need to get this suggestion, enough for a suggestion without overdoing the whole feel. So I'm going to stop there, and we'll see what we can do to enhance this when we add a little bit of our watercolour as well. Now, next in this little exploration of nature, let's have a look at this overhanging tree. Overhanging tree above this little grassy knoll. Not really a knoll, is it? It's a grassy verge, I suppose. Well, let's start again. Let's do our little grass, remembering our contour lines, because that adds a really sort of fun feel, doesn't it? And actually we've got textures to play with here as well. We've got textures in our wooden boards which are forming this seat. So if I just do the seat in a really simple way, we can find that actually these wooden boards have a kind of horizontal texture, don't they? So we can get that kind of feel in as well. And then coming across the top we've got this tree. And the tree we could do as a contour, but actually the texture here we could also do differently. So we could say, no, a lot of the texture of this tree is coming from these branches. So why don't we draw in the branches? Not what we did last time, we added the branches at the end. But this just shows that there's lots of ways of achieving the same end. And then on top of that, what have we got? Well, actually, we can see individual leaves. Now, we're not going to be able to resolve those individual leaves in such a small space as this. What we can do is a bit of that dot marking. So we can find where the loosest leaves are, Start there with a few loose dots, and that's kind of showing that these are little fragile leaves strewn about a tree. And immediately, I think, at least for me, immediately, this kind of effect is giving a very autumnal tree, showing that these leaves are loose, they're going to fall off soon. So our texture is explaining a lot more than just a simple texture, if you like. We can then come back in with our boulder pen, and look, that boulder pen is going to leave bigger marks which more quickly fill up the space. So instead of sort of trying to do everything with one type of dot, remember we have multiple tools at our disposal, and different tools will achieve slightly different feels. And here, look, we can fill up this sort of shadow, this dark area, much more quickly with the same number of dots from a bigger pen. And we've achieved a very different texture to this, but both are saying, look at this tree, and also explaining that this tree perhaps has a different time of year or something different about the leaves. And that will become more clear when we come to our colours. So hopefully you're getting to see that through the colours, through the ink, there are loads of ways. There's not one way. My way is not the right way. There's lots of ways of finding those textures. So explore. Don't just copy. You can copy if you want, of course, and I have no problem with people copying. But if you're feeling sort of brave or wanting to develop your style, then perhaps either copy and then change. Go, you know what, Toby, I quite like that, or I don't like that, and the reason I don't like that, or what I would improve for me, is perhaps, you know, more detail or less detail. Perhaps you just want to capture the swirl of the tree. That's the texture for you. Perhaps you disagree with the shapes that I'm seeing. That's fine. So explore these ideas, and that is what art is all about, being the artist and getting to make these decisions for yourself. So here I just used a green, dropped it in, then added little bits of indigo, this time dark colour, to show this kind of variation in colour. On this I'm just going to use my indigo, a very watery wash, not doing a flat shadow because it's not a flat shadow. It's got all these sort of strafing qualities, hasn't it, coming across. And in the background we can just use a touch of this same idea to show, look, all of these little objects are the same. We're enhancing the texture of the whole image very gently. If we wanted to make more of a deal of this, we could touch in some darker colours, and instantly you get more texture and more emphasis. Over here we've got something completely different in many ways, haven't we? So I'm going to start with a very warm wash of my quinacridone sienna all over this. And I'm going to actually wait for that to dry a little bit so that we can be a little bit more specific about enhancing the textures in the centre of these dark areas, in the valleys as we were calling it. Down here, let's start with our lovely grass. Now the grass is not what this scene is about. So instead of trying to enhance the texture too much, I'm going to leave it really gentle and really plain. And that means that we can come up here and again, just using a little bit of the quinacridones. This is what I used here. And I've used a little bit of, this is green apatite genuine, I should have said, sorry. A little bit of green apatite genuine over here as well. What we're going to do is just use a little bit of our quinacridone sienna for these leaves, but kind of just touch it in, glaze it over, give it that see-through feel. And this will be another lovely one for leaves, for grass, doing some splashes, just some element of randomness in there. And that might be all that your tree needs for texture. You might want to come back, you might want to use a really small brush and do lots of pointillism. There's lots of ways you could achieve it. Similarly over here, you might want to just touch in some little splashes to show the natural feel of what's going on. And now my oak bark has mostly dried, so I'm going to come back in this time. Whatever brown I've used, this time it was quinacridone sienna, I'm going to bring it down, make it more punchy. So that means using more pigment, less water, but also neutralising it a bit with a nice deep blue. And now we can just come in and find these shadow areas and softly apply that colour, just enhancing that shadow. And just like that, I think we've sort of doubled down on the texture that we already had. We could even triple down, so we could wait for it to dry, or we could come back in with some really deep colour immediately and just touch that in a few places. Now the risk, if this isn't a major part of your scene, you can see this is very busy. So the risk is if you go too hard and you go too realistic, that you'll lose whatever the important part of your scene is. But for me, for a little box like this, or for a main part of your scene, if you're doing a study of a tree, then yeah, double down, triple down, really go for it on the shadows, and you'll definitely be enhancing that texture even more. And just like that, we've done our little exploration of trees, of bark in a few different ways. We're going to move on to the final segment where we look at water and reflections, which kind of come together and are also very different. But let's look at techniques we can use to tackle these more tricky subjects. So water and reflections, a couple of more tricky or sort of scary subjects. We're going to start with water, because I think water is something which often can be a bit scary to include. We can feel like, you know what, we need to avoid it because what if we get it wrong? Now let's start with the water on the left in the middle. So what we have is a horizon line. It's going to move up to the top. That's the top of our water essentially. We've got the horizon here, we've got the sky here, everything underneath is water. And what we can do with our pen is just very gently show a few horizontal marks. You can see this again is all about this horizontal marks. And as they come closer, they become bigger. So the marks become bigger because of the scale, because of the perspective coming closer and closer. So that might be all you need. If this scene is not really about doing a detailed study of water, a few little ink marks like that might be more than enough. Similarly, let's take something a bit different. Let's take this raging sea that's underneath it on the bottom left. So here, again, we'll just pop in the horizon line a little bit higher, and we can see this horizon line is less clear because of all that wind and all the mist and all the foam coming from the sea. So instead of a firm line, we have a sort of textural line. Then coming forward, we have these raging what are they called? Waves. And they've got a lot of texture, a lot of sort of foam and stuff going on as well. And then right the way at the front we have, well not the front but in the middle I guess, we have this big wave, and that's got a lot of texture. It's actually got a lot of shadow. And so we've got almost these ability to just hatch in our water, which feels a bit mad, doesn't it, actually applying hatching to our water, but it's certainly one way of showing this shadow and showing what's the sort of madness going on in this sea. Then as we get closer, we've got another texture. This is quite random. It's still got a horizontal feel, but the lines, the marks, the shadows are much more random. And that is just getting the chaos. Compared to the tranquil sea, we have this chaotic sea going here. What's going to be important here in explaining this is when we apply a bit more colour and maybe even a bit more pen. Now, sticking with the water theme, let's move on to water reflections. So in the bottom right, we have this lovely reflection of the sunset, I think, coming down from the sky. So this time I'm going to put the horizon line in the middle, because that will help us to identify how to do these reflections coming down. Again, look, we've got just one little bit of texture coming across the middle, but mostly this is just gentle waves. But if you squint, you'll see there's a lot more darkness at the front and at the sides, and also in this little patch. And these are the shadows being cast by the clouds. And this is an opportunity to use that naturalistic hatching to enhance the texture, but also start to explain to the viewer the areas of darkness. So we can sort of already start to explain some of these light reflections coming down. Now, last but not least, in our little study of water, let's do this river coming towards us. So this time, got a little bit of perspective. So we'll pop in that kind of river bank, and we may as well pop in this cliff face as well. The same on this side. And this is an opportunity to explore not just the water, but also look, we've got this gravel, so we can do the gravelly feel again, then come across. And actually, what's the edge of this river? It's a contour, and it's a contour with grass. Then we've got reflections this time, but the reflection is really just the plain sky. But again, we've got light and shadow, and we've got these kind of swirling loops of darkness. We can even pop in those swirling loops of darkness. Into the background, we'll just pop in a few more cliffs to explain where this river goes. And we're ready to do our water and water reflections in colour. So, starting with our simple sea. Well, a nice way to do a simple sea is with a simple just wash of colour. Now that's a bit too dark. This is some cobalt blue. And I noticed as I'm putting it on that, look, my brush is a bit dry. No problem. Just stop what I'm doing, wash my brush, bring in some water, and then I can wash that colour around before it's dried and become just a dark mark. Going into the back, there's a lot more light being reflected, so we want a lot less intense colour. And it's about these horizontal marks, so I'm bringing my brush back and forward, remembering the texture of the sea to induce that kind of feel coming left and right. Now you might see some yellows in there, you might see some whites. I'm going to say I'm just going to leave it as nice plain whites reflecting forwards. What I am going to do though is also find what I think are some nice indigos in there, especially at the front and in these darker areas. So as we go back, the indigos get less, but just by softly touching it in, we're getting that soft wash of different shadows and light, leaving these white gaps going backwards. Next, and I'm going to come back to this when it's dry, but next we're just going to move on to our sort of mad sea. Now, to get that feeling of madness, I'm just going to start by actually popping in this kind of almost muddy orange sky. Then above that, I'll do a little bit more of a bright yellow. And that will just explain the kind of the mad feel that we've got going on beneath it. So if I had a really calm, normal sky, then the texture underneath it becomes less believable, less easy to understand. Again, I'm just going to start with a little bit of same cobalt blue. So that's kind of our chief colour here. And actually, let's be a bit more interesting. So if we actually look at it, it's always good to plan these things, isn't it? If we actually look at it, what do we have? We don't have a cobalt blue. We have a kind of turquoise. So I can cheat. I've got a bit of cobalt turquoise here, but wait, that's way too bright. So instead, an effective way of making a blue-green for the sea is literally just adding a touch of a deep green or a tiny touch of yellow and brown to your blue. And then we end up with this turquoise. So all I've done here is I've added a deep green. And actually, look, that's a much better colour for that deeper shade of sea, the deeper shade, which is that kind of shadowed, slightly mad sea we have. And then just going to use that colour and put it in these little patches of hatching. This sea is actually a lot more white, a lot less blue than the other ones we've got because of all the foam. There's another one where getting that range of shadows, so maybe a little bit of dark colour. I'm using indigo, a bit of something like a Payne's grey might be great here. Getting that feel of the dark sort of splashes going might be really useful. And into the distance, just having maybe a really light wash, a really gentle wash of just mild tone to connect the sea and the sky. Just to show that this isn't a flat texture. Even though there's lots of white, it's definitely not a flat texture, is it? No, it's a bit of a mad texture going all out through this scene. This is definitely a place where splashes might really help. That might be splashes of water, or it might be splashes of pigment. And yeah, it's going to make a bit of chaos, but that chaos is going to be translating what's really going on in that scene, all those textures. Now we've got our lovely reflection, haven't we? So again, let's just start with the sky, a really simple blue sky, because then we can just add in a nice gentle pink. So I'm going to just use a little bit of my red and lots of water to make it pink, because pink is red and white. The white in watercolour is our page, so if you use lots of water, with a red, you'll get that pink tinge coming through. So we've got this pink, and we can work out now that the pink is just reflecting towards us. So a really nice way that I like doing this is to apply that little layer of blue, and then actually we can get that feeling of texture just by washing it forward, because reflections are coming towards us. So that reflection marks should be vertical. When you're drawing reflections, they need to come in towards you like that. Out here, we know it's got a deeper colour, so we'll add in some blue, perhaps even, again, some of this indigo. So that's my indigo colour up here, just to get that darker area. So the reflections, the marks of reflection are vertical, but the waves are horizontal. So having done that, we can come back in with a quite dry brush and literally just now add in the texture. So the reflection is not actually a texture, the reflection has got texture from the waves, from the sea. So we come back in, just gently touching the point of our brush across, and we start introducing that horizontal texture to the vertical reflections. I hope that makes sense, and I hope you can see that now what we have is this soft reflection with some gentle lines coming across. Now moving on, we've got this, and this is a very actually moody scene, but with a very bright river. All that light is almost white, not quite as white as the sky, but almost white. And actually the colours out here are very green, so we're going to double down on our greeny blue and just try that. And it might be too much, but this is the experiments you can have. And now all we do is just apply that greeny blue, but only to our shadows. And that might be some really specific touches now for the texture. It might be little dots. You can see in places it feels like dotted and very gentle. It might also just be the shadows underneath areas. But always remembering that these ripples are sort of these key element that we're trying to get in. Over here, a little bit more depth to our shadows. And that is probably all I would want to do for this kind of quick sketch of a river. Now with that, I can see that, yeah, my other ideas, they are dry now. So we can see what we can do to enhance this if we wanted a bit more texture. So for me, that'd be a little bit of blue coming in, and just around where I've got these little ink marks, this cobalt blue can just inform the shadows a little bit more. And that, again, is a really simple touch. It might be all we need to add on. Some people will like adding in some white as well, so you can enhance the reflections either by being more careful and leaving more white paper, or by coming back with a little white marker, a white watercolour pen, and just dropping in these colours. Into our mad sea, we could, now it's a bit drier, we could enhance the shadows, really get a bit more of that drama just by touching in this case, a bit more of my indigo, just touching it in at the bottoms of some of these blue shapes. That gives the impression of more shadow. And now finally coming across to this, we just do the same thing, so little touches of horizontal colour. And that's a bit too much, but that's okay. That's why we're gentle, so that if we do something too much, we don't overdo it. We might even want to double down a little bit on our pinks, just in a couple of places. Just touching it in and then softening it out a little bit, so that it's just enriching that, providing a little bit more textured reflection, so making sure we've got those horizontal marks, some of that light coming through. And there we go. So another little study of reflections on water. Last but not least, we have reflections in windows. So last but not least, as I said, reflections in windows. We have some fun ideas here from this same set of mood board references. So let's start by adding in this little window. And remember, the contour of the window has some texture which will reflect the sort of character of the building. Now I'm not sure why I've given it a little top like this. In my head I think that's what was on the page. Of course it's not. I am using the reference from the top with these lovely red bricks. But you know what, it doesn't matter if we make little mistakes, especially when we're just doing studies to enhance our understanding of colours and texture. So forgive the funny mistake there. And moving on, just a couple more details here of the frames. and we can start capturing some of these windows. I'm going to, because my page is very small, I'm going to simplify this so that we have a bigger area of frame to work with. So instead of having what is, I think, looks like 8 windows per block, I've just got 4, which is fine. And what have we got? So whenever we have reflections, in fact, let's do a little house as a demo as well, as a really simple demo, because then I can explain the principles of reflections in just a simple house. So whenever we have reflections, what we are looking at is an angle from our vision. So if we give this house, we'll give it a door to make it make sense. Our vision is here. Approximately there is where our head is. So the reflections are based on the angle we're looking at. So here we're looking straight at the window, so the reflections are coming straight back at us. So everything we can see in this is probably, not definitely, but probably going to be quite dark. Perhaps it's going to be greens and reds. So we can start by hatching in a little bit of that darkness. Also, we'll look in a couple of these other references at how you get light reflecting off. So using these bits of hatching shows that vertical light reflecting off. Up here, if we're looking at this window, our angle of vision might be like this to that. So what are we going to see? We're going to see the sky. Now at the very bottom of the window it might be a little bit of darkness, but then at the top we're going to be moving to light blue sky. So the textures we get are going to be a sort of combination of smooth blues, but then perhaps more like challenging greens and things which are happening behind us. Maybe even those reds from other houses in the background. And then also little drops of reflected light. So if we look at this window, what we can see is actually there's not too much texture from the reflections, but there is a lot of different tones being reflected. So we can find that some of these windows are much darker than others. And this is where we can actually introduce our own texture. This might not be real texture. We can introduce our own textures which are showing the process of introducing darkness, the processes of our instruments. Also, we can see that there are some textures based on little bits of light. So we got like some of these windows have light in a corner. So introducing this reflection, this forming a sense of texture in a couple of the windows by not hatching them fully is a really effective technique. Then we can come back in with our, perhaps just our blue, really simple, using a nice bit of cobalt blue, and we can just drop in those colours into the windows we know are lighter. So in this instance, of course, the windows are actually quite white. I'm just adding the blue to demonstrate the process, or it might be that you add the blue to show what you think about the scene, or make it feel the way you want it to feel. Then in these others, we can use a more murky colour. So I'm going to use a bit of Perylene Violet here. And that can just gently show that some of these windows have a different feel. But I'm also leaving some bright white to enhance the texture and enhance the idea of reflection. So it's a much more fluid, adaptive process. You might drop in, some of these reflections are very varied, so you might drop in some more watercolours. And this way we are celebrating what the watercolours can bring, we're celebrating what the ink can bring. We're not doing a super hyper realistic version of this reflection, but we're certainly getting the idea of reflection through texture. So that is my biggest sort of learning point about getting window reflections, is often they're very complex, very tricky, and it's much more effective to get the idea and the concept across with simple ideas like blue for the top windows and dark for the bottom windows, rather than trying to spend a long time getting the exact reflections. Now if we move to our lovely cafe scene down here, this is another sort of opportunity certainly to explore the texture that comes from more complicated reflections. So here we might just add in the background, we've got our little people, so just do real simple shape-based people. There's quite a few of them in here, isn't there? And notice how, because it's behind the window, I'm keeping them very very gentle. They don't want to overtake the window. If they're bolder than the window frame, so if we've got the window frame like this, and we've got the people bolder than the window frame, then the people will appear to be in front of it instead of behind it. Now, one key part of these reflections is actually that we can see through. So behind we can see areas of dark, we can see areas of light, and that's going to come into how we sort of focus on the textures coming through. Equally, you can see here, we can really clearly see what we often see in reflections, lots of long vertical lines, vertical light coming from a car here, coming from some structure behind us here. So that's where, again, I think vertical hatching is a really great way of just showing that there's lots of complexity, complex textures coming through, as well as focusing on the light and dark. So the dark is down here, the light is up here, but there's also sort of vertical slits being focused on here as well. And again, probably enough already from the pen. We don't want to overdo it. We can come in, and I like to start with the light. So here I'm going to use a little bit of my red, a little bit of my yellow, and then with that we'll have a nice orange. Maybe needs a little bit more yellow for my glowing orange feel. And that orange can suddenly capture a lot of this light. A little bit of yellow to enhance the feel of this actually glowing bulb. And then underneath, we'll just take a nice neutral mix, a little neutral mix like so, and pop that in, remembering to enhance that vertical feel by using vertical strokes. And then also, we call it texture, but because it's like natural, it's not really got many hard edges, so we then can come in and soften what's going on. So although we've induced a lot of texture, we're then removing some of it through simple softening, coming back in with a clean brush, touching the edges, leaving some of these hard patches of white, but also removing some of them. And later, if we wanted, we could introduce even more tone, doing some wet on wet, dropping in, even finding some of these greens in the plants, but just being careful not to overdo it, and remembering the textures coming through are coming from the complexities of the light. And sometimes it'll be the surface of the window, but often it's the complexities of the light which are suggesting that texture. And let's just do the other window. To fill up our page, we'll do the other window. And this time we can just see how, if we have a couple of people in front, so look, if I make these people bold, and I know this isn't texture, but I think it's a useful point anyway. I put these people in exactly the same place as those two people. But because they're bold, and because they're in front, then if we do these same ideas of texture, these people are in front of these textural lines, well look, we end up with people who are in front of the window instead of behind it. And I think maybe I'm stretching the definition of texture, but for me, that idea of where is the texture is really important in enhancing the whole feel of the image as well. So it's not just about applying texture loosely, it's also about using textures, using marks, using everything to enhance the art, to enhance the explanation of the scene, and make it easier for the people viewing your scene to understand what's going on, understand the order of objects. And that's why I call these textures shortcuts, visual shortcuts, sketching shortcuts, ways that you can really simply enhance the feel of your scene without the fuss. And just like that, I'm just putting my last couple of colours down so that I can remember them and use them for future reference, and we're done. And just like that, we've completed 2 full pages of textures. Don't forget, if you subscribe, you'll be able to find the previous 2 lessons in the series, one looking at house textures, the other looking at general texture concepts. And of course, you can check out far more detailed courses on sketchloose.co.uk if you're interested in learning more. So thank you everyone for watching my little sketching videos. If you enjoy my content, please do subscribe to my channel because it makes me really, really happy. Thanks again.